Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Nice to see some familiar names there, as well as people on our panel. Thinking of Jojo, although I can't actually see you. I hope you're well. Hi, how are you doing? So I'll just say at this point, it seems that we're already recording because they set that up. So just to be aware. I'll be chairing this panel. Pritish is he's running a bit late, but he's gonna join, I think virtually for this one. And then miraculously, we might find ourselves in the same physical space for the second one. But we also are one presentation down, well, in the sense that the presenters of the third paper on this panel, which is the one Frankenstein or Industrial Commons. Unfortunately, Kyung-Hoon Kim is rather unwell, and I think was going to lead the presentation. So now he has been in touch to say that they're also going to have trouble joining. So I think they won't be with us for the discussion, unfortunately. So there will be three, well, as you know, there won't be three full presentations. There'll be three 2-minute pitches, and then a discussion of the three papers. So that does give us a little bit more time in these quite short sessions. And it means that I won't be perhaps quite as strict as I might have been on the 2-minute pitches. If you end up extending to 3 minutes, that's totally fine. So I won't cut you off until you get near 3 minutes, basically. And as mentioned in my email, and I'm sorry we didn't get in touch earlier about the format, but I've basically stolen an idea from a colleague's panel, which was that if people are going to put up questions at the end of their presentations, the questions which are on the slides or pre-recorded presentations, if you could make sure to repeat those as part of your short pitch at the end, any question you put at the end, so that in our first round of discussion, and as you can see, it's evident that most of the discussion is going to be among the panel members anyway. So perhaps people can pick up question by one of the other presenters for a first round of comments and discussion on each other's questions, if you will. I also have a few questions myself I can throw into the mix, and then hopefully we can go into a more open discussion. There are 1 or 2 comments on the DSA website as well. So for people who haven't seen how this works, there's a kind of discussion comment box underneath the panel presentations for each paper or each session, so we can go through those questions too. Yeah, so I guess maybe we'll wait 1 more minute and see if anyone shows up, as a couple of people have been joining, and then we can begin. How are you, Jojo? Anyway, sorry to continue that conversation. Nice to see you.
I know. I was waiting that DSA would happen in person. I haven't been back there for a while, so.
I know. Well, I was so keen. Yeah, I'm in Manchester actually, and I said at some point we'll be physically with Pritish because we thought it would be nice to actually chair together, even if the rest of the conference is virtual, which will happen. But yeah, Pritish will join us in due course. So, but let's get cracking, because obviously we do only have 40 minutes. It's quite nice to have a bit more breathing space, but let's get going. I'm going to proceed in the order that the presentations are listed on the page for this particular session. So that means beginning with productive modeling. So that's Seth and Alberto. I very much enjoyed watching this presentation. So I don't know if you want to go ahead with your 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next person and start the discussion proper after that. And Pritish is now with us, so good timing, Pritish. So Seth, I'm not sure if you're leading this, but fire away.
Yeah, I can just try to explain what we're doing in a couple of minutes, or do my best. So thanks everyone. Happy to join. As much as I like in-person conferences, I do also appreciate the opportunity to participate in this remote setting. So thanks for having me. Alberto couldn't make it. He's traveling right now. So just to say a little bit about this paper, we are attempting a comparative case, subnational case study of the middle income trap in Mexico, 2 states in Mexico, Jalisco and Querétaro. And we think that there's a lot of potential for this general model of subnational comparisons of how regions sort of struggle or try to work through problems of middle income trap. And so one of the big lessons of this paper that we found is that there were 2 very different roles for the state level government. The word state here gets used too much in too many different ways, but basically these state level governments, Mexico has a federal system somewhat similar to the United States and elsewhere. And so the state governments of Jalisco and Querétaro had very different roles in kind of marshaling and corralling investment for development purposes. And so that led to actually very different development outcomes in the 2 states in the past 40 years. And so what you see is that Querétaro has pretty specific, pretty high level, at least for Mexico and most middle income countries, industrial upgrading, technological advancement, education, skills advancement for its workforce. Whereas, and so that's in very pretty narrow channels in Querétaro, whereas in Jalisco, it's a little more dispersed and diversified across industries, but also the extremes of upgrading in Jalisco aren't as high as in Querétaro. And overall, Jalisco sort of underperforms growth expectations during the last 40 years, whereas Querétaro vastly exceeds economic growth expectations. And so we treat these as having pros and cons in the ultimate paper. In the abstract, we suggest that Jalisco didn't do well, whereas Querétaro did. But I think after our recent field research in Jalisco, we came to be convinced that it was more of a set of different sets of pros and cons as opposed to success and not success. So we didn't want to be too positive, negative, or dualistic about it in the end. I think that a missing piece of this paper that might have to do with feedback is that we did a previous paper just about the state of Querétaro, where we looked at coalitions in that, political coalitions in that state. And in this paper so far, we haven't gone as specifically into the makeup of the coalitions of the 2 states, in part because the big difference garnering those outcomes was that Querétaro state was much more actively involved, whereas Jalisco state kind of held back and did not get very involved, leaving private sector actors to be the ones to kind of coordinate and try to create public goods. So I'm just trying to briefly sum up here to say that I guess one question has to do with what things people might be curious about knowing about these 2 states, given the basic contours of the story. But I think that at the very least right now, if we're talking about a main takeaway, I think we were surprised at the extent to which these subnational, even going in with the premise of comparing differences in subnational state governments, we were actually surprised at how different these 2 were. And how closely they relate to the major differences between the 2 states' economic development performance in the last 40 years. So I'll try to stop there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Anyone got any thoughts on that? Hold on to them for now. And we'll move on to the next presentation, which is Sebastian on Rwanda.
Right. Yes, thank you very much. So hello, everyone. Thank you to Tom and British, who both are also experts on Rwanda. So I've obviously read a lot of your work. Right. So I am presenting on Rwanda, specifically on Rwanda's economic transformation. So in my video or in my presentation, I first explained how the general political economy in the country since 2000 has led to impressive success in many government endeavors, including economic development, but also many other plans. And but then I go over to say that there has been significant policy failure in Rwanda, and I present one specific sector case study, which is in my opinion, particularly spectacular failure. That was Rwanda's attempt to transform its food crop sector in a green revolution style. So from traditional smallholder peasant production into modern, highly productive, high yield food production. And I show that this that there was apparent success in an explosion of production levels was really a mirage, which was driven by the country's performance contract system known as Inihigo. and this system compelled local civil servants to report success when in reality there was failure. So my argument is that the top-down governance mode of the ruling party, which came from its own history and its lack of trust towards the population, that this governance mode is unfit for many grand transformation challenges, such as in agriculture, but also in, for example, industrial development, which British has worked on. And yeah, I'm looking forward to receiving feedback, comments, questions. I think the question to consider in the discussion might be whether my argument makes sense in that the type of rigid top-down governance led to policy failure in more complex sectors versus other key factors that might have been decisive there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sebastian. So we'll come back to themes and questions around that later, but let's move on to the third and final, given that we're missing one presentation, which is Salam.
Right. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. This is my first time presenting at the DSA, and I'm really happy to be presenting in this panel because I feel there's a lot that speaks across these papers. My paper is about rapid industrialization in Ethiopia, and I'm using the case of Ethiopia to speak to accelerated industrialization in Africa more generally, and the kinds of implications this phenomenon in the 21st century has for urbanization on the continent. So basically what I'm trying to speak to is how the authoritarian politics specifically, shapes urban policy and industrial policy and their interactions. And if you've had a chance to see my presentation, I argue this by developing three main analytical threads that show how conceptual fragmentation is driven by the survival strategies of regimes that are getting established. Policy coordination is impeded by personal rule in some ways, while personal rule, highly centralized personal rule, does promote policy integration to some extent. It also creates structural problems that affect policy coordination. And finally, the third thread is on how parastatals that are very closely linked to the party, like in the case of Rwanda as well, how they affect infrastructural integration in the urban industrial nexus. Now, I don't want to go further into explaining my paper, because what I was trying to do in this very short presentation is talk about a very complex political context and kind of break it down to show the connections between the evolution of distribution of authority in the regime and the relationship between urban and industrial policy. But I know that I used a lot of acronyms that may have been difficult to navigate. So I hope you had a chance to just pause on some of the slides where I was rushing through. I don't know if it's at this point, Tom, that you want us to link with the other papers, but I had a couple of thoughts that could possibly link.
Well, I think, yeah, we'll go into that round now. I'm not sure whether everybody, I might have missed it, if everybody's sort of left a question hanging, because I know there's a question on your final slide, Salam.
Okay.
Not every, but maybe it's worth everybody just recapping on those questions. Do you want to do yours, Salam? And then I'll go back to the others and say, did they have a question that they want to just re-emphasize before we go back round?
Great, yeah. So the main thing I guess the major takeaway of my paper is just showing a very strong link between authoritarian politics and especially processes of centralization in authoritarian regimes and their effect on urban industrial integration. And I think this speaks to the other papers in a way, because Mexico shows us somehow that there was decentralization in the authoritarian regime that has stayed in power for so long, that allows for kind of a divergence between cases. Well, whereas Rwanda, again, we can speak about a very highly centralized, very personalist regime and how, yeah, this affects industrial policy in specific ways. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Just going back in reverse, Sebastian, I don't know if this was across the whole conference, right? People were asked to put a question at the end. So I don't know if you want to do that briefly.
Sure. Yeah, so I didn't see before that we were supposed to pose a question, but yeah, as I just said before and would do now. So for what I briefly summarized, or for those who have seen the video, yeah, my question would basically be, especially to those who know Rwanda maybe a bit better, does this make sense, talking about this rigid top-down governance as maybe the main factor, or is this, I mean, is it too reductionist because there are always other factors which might play into policy failure? So this would be the question.
And then back over to you, Seth. I don't know if you want to remind people of the question, and then we can take all of your thoughts on some of those questions. Yeah.
Sure. I guess I'll just try to restate it by saying that, you know, these states, we think they do have pretty clear different outcomes in Mexico. And so I'm interested, what we didn't get to in the presentation is exactly the internal dynamics of the state governments that might have pertained to that. And I would just connect it to something that didn't make it in the presentation, which is this previous paper on only Querétaro, which, as it happens, recently came out in the Journal of Development Studies, so relevant, I guess, to the conference too. But is just that in Querétaro, we did think that there were aspects of the diversity of actors involved in the coalition, the breadth of sectors and class and geographic backgrounds that they come from, and the power balance among actors in the coalition. And so with that added to the mix, just what people think about what they're wondering about these states. You know, a lot of these papers talk about or bring in a political settlements framework. And so maybe thinking empirically from what that framework would suggest to look for in these states, that's the question I want to ask of the group of people here, is what you would like to hear more about.
Okay, that's great. And I know obviously people are using, in some cases, political settlements framework to think through in the second session as well. So it would be useful now to hear, does anyone among the three of you want to reflect on those questions asked by others now at this point, before we open up a little more? Feel free to raise your hand virtually or in real life. Salam. You're on mute. Sorry, you're on mute, Salam.
Sorry. Yeah, I thought Sebastian's question was very interesting. Is it reductive to say that top-down governance and centralization drives so much of how industrial policy unfolds? I think in the Ethiopian case, this is central. There's no way of getting around it, because the design of the policies, the planning, the actual development, it's all very centralized. So it's very hard to explain the politics of industrial policy or urban policy in contexts like Rwanda or Ethiopia without dealing with top-down governance or centralization. So I think that links it somehow with my paper as well. But I think I just wanted to say, I think it's spot on. There's nothing reductive about focusing in on what that entails. Yeah.
Apologies. I'm struggling a bit in navigating with the program between these screens. So we also have Jeanette, I believe, for the last paper. So I don't know if you want to come in on any of these issues, but thank you, Salam.
Thank you. I think my paper is for the next session, I believe.
Yeah, and Sakura as well. So, but if you have a question now, then go ahead, and we'll go back to this panel.
I'll think about if something comes up. Thank you so much.
No problem. And obviously, I hope that everyone will be participating in both, so we can carry a lot of these conversations through. But at this point, does Sebastian or Seth want to reflect on the questions of others on the panel? Just go ahead and turn on your mic. I can't. Seth? Yeah.
Is it my turn? Just
it's your
making sure.
turn. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I guess one question that came up was sort of about centralized authoritarian regimes, and I guess sort of a thought about that with the other two papers that comes up, and there was sort of a thought, well, maybe in Mexico, because it transitioned out of an authoritarian regime sort of over the course of the 1990s, maybe that shows that you need to sort of break up an authoritarian regime to get this subnational variation. And I think I think it's an important question in terms of the relation between the subnational and the national. And I guess where that leads me to at least what I know from the other papers on this panel is I wonder about these other cases, Ethiopia, Rwanda. In Ethiopia, I wonder about geographic variation in the consolidation of the power of the state, the national state regime. I'm not an Ethiopia expert, but my understanding is that there are strong regional differences in Ethiopia, that alternation between regimes brings rise and fall of powers from different regions of the country at different times. And so one thing that may be interesting to look at would be at the variation in the scope of the regime's power across different territories of the country, the extent of their power, and how that might affect local differences or room for local differences. In the Rwanda case, there was some variation on the industry level, and which may correlate somewhat to space as well in terms of having a coffee growing region versus a region that grows other crops. But the way it was stated was kind of different industries and their sort of possibly their different coordination problems. And the thing that made me think of actually was some of the recent work by Donor and co-authors about different developmental tasks requiring different kinds of skills or capacities on the part of the state. And so actually for the Rwanda paper, one thing I was wondering about was, well, just sort of playing a naive person with it is, why is it so much different to increase the productivity of agriculture versus upgrade the value of coffee exports? I mean, on the one hand, we could say we would expect there to be some differences, but to get into detail about why those differences require different capacities on the part of the state, it would be interesting to hear more about that.
Thank you. That's great. I mean, I had some similar questions, but let's keep Sebastian here. Do you want to go now, and then we'll open up more widely?
Right. Yeah. Thank you to the others for your comments. So maybe first I can say that as we are all using political settlements, or at least partially, or have looked into that, I mean, one of the things of political settlements analysis is that you really look very deeply into the trajectory of your country. So even though there are some parallels between some of these countries that we have now here, there are of course huge differences. So this is always why it's kind of hard to comment on other countries, because the uniqueness of each country is like a central point. But anyway, so regarding to your comments, yeah, so I guess that spatial differentiation in Rwanda really does not play any role so far. It might come to that, but now it's just a tiny country, very centralized, not big differences between different regions regarding economic activity, only minor. Then maybe coming specifically to your question, Seth. So actually, if we just focus on coffee, and there we see coffee processing and coffee production, so really the cultivation. There's also a huge difference, because the Rwandan government really tried for 20 years to increase the coffee production level, so they're actually coffee cherries, and they failed. Similarly to failing food crops, to increase the production level of food crops, while they completely transformed, or one could also say just created out of nothing, this coffee processing sector, really with a lot of value addition, now going also into roasting, but the main part is going into full processing, which really fetches much higher prices. So yeah, why was that the case? I think that, well, creating a sector, well, actually in coffee, and maybe Priti should come in there because he's really an expert in that. But the more I worked on it, the more it seemed to me it was donors. Actually, William Easterly, who's a huge aid critic, he had this best practice aid case study on Rwandan coffee processing, where he said their donor work really worked tremendously well. And it was really, they bringing the expertise in, the know-how, it needs to come from somewhere, it came from them, and they brought enough investment, and the government wanted it, so many factors added in, but in the end, it was really donor expertise and also investments, which really enabled this, while coffee cultivation and food crops cultivation, it was so complicated, and reforming smallholder farming is one of the most complicated things in development, I think, and they just failed because it was too complicated, and they didn't have a very good policy which was nuanced and so on.
Thank you. This is really fascinating. I'm learning a lot from this discussion already. I don't know if at this point, we have 15 minutes or so left. Are there questions in the broader audience, or well, so raise your hand virtually or otherwise, but in the meantime, I can see Pritish has his hand up. So do you want to come back on that, Pritish? But in the meantime, please do raise your hands if you have questions.
Hi, everyone. So thanks so much for joining us. I really enjoyed the papers. They're all really interesting, and I think they tie together really well also. So unfortunately, we had one of the papers missing, but I first with Seth and Alberto's paper, I found this really interesting, I guess, also from a slightly different perspective from the others, I guess, much more linked from donor, etc., than the other papers, which are much more coming from the Khan political settlements perspective in some way. Related to that, I know you pointed to this in your question as well, but in thinking about these two locations in Mexico, you made the point that the state allows private capital to do these things. And I was just wondering if this was a question rather of the state choosing to do something, if it was about the power relations between state and business in these two locations. And you didn't say much about the historical relationship or the distribution of power between the state and private businesses in these two countries, and whether the business private capital had more power in this area for that, and whether that influenced decisions. But anyway, I thought that was a really interesting paper in a country I don't know much about. But so Sebastian's paper, of course, this is very close to my research, but again, I found it super interesting, especially since I studied coffee and tourism in Rwanda as well. So yeah, so I agreed with most, pretty much all of it really, but I was just wondering how it was kind of adding to what has already been said in a way. So there are different papers that talk about the varied outcomes associated with implementation in Rwanda, right? They do it from using political settlements perspective. They do it from other ways as well, even using donors' differential capacities, right? So I just wanted to hear a bit more about how you're adding to the literature, because you do mention the other literatures, but it wasn't clear how you're building from those arguments. The other point, you made a point in your presentation about how that's close to embedded autonomy, but I wasn't very clear about how that was embedded autonomy, because in other parts of the pets don't have knowledge of sectors. But I just wanted clarification, maybe some discussion around that. And Salam, paper is really very interesting to take on Ethiopia's industrial policy, something I haven't seen yet much of. Of course, there's a link in the urban studies literature about from Seth Schindler, etc., talking about getting the territory right, etc., which you're probably familiar with also. I did want to hear a bit more about how, after Melez's death, this capacity to, at least for the TPLF, with them moving all the industry to Mekelle, especially in the last 2-3 years. I mean, before the pandemic, really, at least, how that plays out. So how did a section of the EPRDF shift getting the territory right away from the rest of the coalition? Is that right? Yeah, that's it from me. Thanks so much for all the papers once again.
Great, thank you, Pritish. Time is running on. I want to give everyone a good chance to respond, and I think Let's take Glenn's question, because you had your hand up. If you could be as quick as you can, and then let's go in reverse order this time. So we'll start with Salam, then Sebastian, then Seth. But let's have Glenn's question first.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you to the presenters. I'm a bit nervous about asking, because in case you ask me questions in the next session, but I'm interested in what changes these kind of settlements that you talk about, and how we think about what might change that in terms of how economic kind of processes might shift the balance of forces. I'm thinking to, reading sort of Okbe say about Ethiopia, that there's kind of a bit of a caution about the emergence of national kind of powerful economic interests, even though there's a lot of rhetoric there, because it might engineer further kind of political changes, and whether or not that's a feature which I think maybe might have been there in between the lines in the Mexico case. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's start with Salam and then work backwards. You're on mute again, Salam. Sorry.
Still getting used to these online sessions. Sorry. Yeah, so just to wrap up and also speak back to what Seth and Sebastian mentioned, Seth, what you raised about differentiation generally within the national territory, within centralized rule, and how the party has more or less influence in different states. That is true in economic policy more generally. I mean, some states are able to define their policy more closely, better than others, but the industrialization project is very centrally driven, and there is a lot of ethnic negotiation because the state is structured as ethnic regions. There is a lot of ethnic negotiation about the distribution of these industrial projects. So I don't know if that answers your question. Sebastian, I just wanted to speak to some of the stuff you're saying about coffee processing versus production. This is also something that's big in Ethiopia. So the Ethiopian coffee sector, I mean, coffee is the major export for Ethiopia, and the sector still relies on really outdated processing set in place maybe 20, 30 years ago. And the government hasn't really put a lot of work into processing, hasn't invested. So while there's a lot of production, the processing is the problem. So exports, there's a lot of fiddling with the export numbers as well. So I don't know if that's useful for your case, but I just thought I'd raise it. Finally, Pritesh's question of how the death of Mallas changed the spatial structure of industrial development. So essentially what the death of Mallas did was break up the center of the party. And that meant, because it's a party state, relationship between sectors was also affected because party leaders led different sectors. So this affected the coordination of urban ministries with the industrial development corporations. But also in center-region relations, because Mallas had been able to hold the ethnic parties in these different regions together, his death meant a kind of an unleashing of ethno-nationalist sentiments in all regions, and a kind of pull from every region to have more investment in their regions. So this kind of also drove the fragmentation of the industrial basic ecosystem, I guess. Yeah, thank you, that's all.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so regarding the different questions, first British, what do I add to the literature? In this presentation and also in the paper with which it was related, I basically add this specific story about agricultural production overestimation, the mechanism, how it came about, which was the Imihigo system connected to the other data system and so on, and then the correction and what this tells about the governance mode. So basically it's more evidence on this rigid or over rigid system where Shimoni and Dai looked at energy, and Williams looked at education, and you looked at industrial development. Right. So this is that, but then regarding the overall political settlement and the development of Rwanda, I think there already has been in recent years a lot of work, and it really seems to me that this small circle of authors using political settlements or similar things really have come to the core of what is going on in Rwanda regarding the nature of the state, especially regarding development. So there, what I will add, I mean, in my PhD thesis, I just am finishing this now and just try to do the PhD thesis, but then later in papers, I want to add some specific nuances, maybe to get this, yeah, to add a little bit, because I think the literature has come very far in the last years to really capture what is happening in Rwanda. Regarding embedded autonomy, what I was saying in the presentation is that if you see embedded autonomy as one of the crucial necessary factors of an effective state, then this is, I think, originally coming from Shimoni, who said that autonomy is there, but embeddedness is missing, to just say it in one sentence. And then actually to the question which was raised by Glenn Robbins about the economic processes that might shift political settlement forces or the political power. It was related to the other studies, but I can say something to Rwanda as well. I think this is really a very interesting question. And in Rwanda, it seems that the government, one of the main goals is to prevent exactly that. So this could be one of the structural factors inhibiting some parts of development, because if they really try everything they can to prevent powerful economic interests from arising, then this might clash with necessary development processes. And now I need to finish and hand over.
Great, thank you. Seth?
I guess I'll just try to briefly pick up on that theme that Sebastian raised, which sounds to me sort of like an idea of, you know, the state generating economic development, running a risk of a genie getting out of the bottle, right? Is that you try to build up the private sector and then they dwarf you. And so where are you then? And so I think that also connects back to Pratisha's question about the power relations between the state and the private sector in Mexico. And I'll just mention that, you know, it came in at the very end of our presentation. And I think it's in part because it really needs to be a separate paper looking at the deeper historical formation of state-private sector relations, at least in our cases. It's just started to spill over the edges of what we were already talking about. And so I think we're coming close to closing. I'd love to talk about it a lot with you all, but I guess I'll just briefly say that, you know, in the Querétaro, Jalisco case, you have a difference where Querétaro, in its remoteness and smallness, and in a sense, its economic barrenness over the course of centuries, you know, looking back to colonialism, over a long period of time, tries and tries again to get the private sector moving and get some dynamism. And it's through those failed efforts over the course of most of the 20th century that you see the roots of the state-private sector relations that seem to be working a little better today or more recently. Whereas in Jalisco, you had a lot of non-state driven investment. It was already a very strong commercial region with a lot of private sector development because there was a lot of natural resources, ports. It was sort of a more naturally propitious environment for investment. And so the state never did have to get much involved for there to be activity there. But what you see is small firm formation, short-term investment, more in real estate and property. And so the private sector is active, is just not investing in long-term capability changing types of activities. And so, you know, capital intensive, let's say. So I don't mean for this to unfurl into a whole new panel or discussion or discourse on my part, but I just kind of want to point to some of those issues and maybe try to just say, for me at least, hearing from the other presenters, I think that there's a lot of exciting scope for variation within developing countries, whether spatially or across industries or over time. And so I liked hearing about that from the other papers. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And that's really impeccable timing. We do have a question from Jojo in the box. And I had a few questions I could ask, but I think we should, I want to try and chair this and keep things on time, but also mindful of the fact that we can continue this conversation in the next session. And I hope that, Jojo, I hope you're able to make it. So maybe you can ask that, but it also chimes with an overall comment I had, which is how interesting it is in a way that the answers to the questions you're all posing in your research seem to me very much rooted in politics and governance and bureaucratic process and state institutions, not so much in political economy around the distribution of power, the role of vested interests. You know, you've all got a story that is very much a governance story, which in some ways isn't surprising when we think about the literature on the state and development, but it does, I think, show the value of sometimes really interrogating those governance and bureaucratic processes and how they differ between sectors and between regions. And so to have a panel that was a subnational comparison as well as sectoral comparison, and then in Salam's case, trying to understand things at the scale of a whole kind of regime over time, has been a really interesting set of juxtapositions. So I hope we can pick this up with another set of really interesting and again, quite different papers in many ways, they're looking at similar challenges. That will be in half an hour. I think it's a separate link, but the same format, and I hope to see many of you there. Certainly the presenters, and hopefully the rest of you too. Okay, thank you very much everyone for joining. Bye.